What if you learned that one of the most famous countercultural icons of the 1960s, like a guy who practically pioneered the psychedelic movement and defined the anti-establishment ethos for a whole generation, actually started out his adult life as this totally clean-cut champion college wrestler who idolized John Wayne and practiced ventriloquism on the side.
I mean, it sounds like the setup to a really surreal joke.
Right.
The contrast between those two phases of his life is just, it's almost impossible to reconcile on paper. It kind of defies every stereotype we have about how counterculture figures are actually forged.
It really does.
Yeah.
So today we are taking a deep dive into the extraordinary, highly contradictory, and honestly, ultimately tragic life of American author Ken Kesey.
Yeah.
Our mission here is to understand the mechanics of this transformation.
Yeah.
For you listening, we want to figure out how this one small-town athlete became the living, breathing bridge between the Beat generation of the 1950s and the hippie movement of the 60s.
And to do that, I mean, we really have to examine how his life was arguably as much a work of art as his actual novels.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because this is a narrative that blends extreme creative genius, highly classified government experimentation, and eventually some very genuine, very grounding tragedy.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the deeply conventional foundation that somehow served as the launch pad for this wildly unconventional life.
Right, the early years.
Yeah. So Kesey was born in Colorado in 1935, but his family moved to Springfield, Oregon when he was just a kid around 1946. And you really have to picture him in this era.
He's a serious athlete.
He wasn't just a casual weekend athlete. He was an elite 174-pound high school and college wrestler. Like, he was so good that he almost qualified for the Olympics before a severe shoulder injury sidelined him.
Wow.
Even today, he holds a top 10 all-time winning percentage for University of Oregon wrestling.
Which, tells us a tremendous amount about his baseline psychology.
That's it.
Well, wrestling is this incredibly grueling, solitary, and regimented sport. It requires a level of extreme physical discipline, weight management, mental conformity.
It's intense.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You don't achieve that kind of winning percentage without an ironclad work ethic, which is a trait you would just never associate with the chaotic, freewheeling figure he later became known as.
Right. And his early interests were just so traditional. He was devouring adventure novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs and westerns by Zane Grey.
Oh, yeah.
He was watching John Wayne movies. He was doing magic tricks and hypnotism. I mean, it's the ultimate 1950s all-American archetype.
It really is.
He even eloped with his 7th-grade sweetheart, Faye Haxby, in 1956.
Sorry.
And from everything the source material shows us, Kesey credited Faye as his absolute anchor.
Yeah, she was crucial.
She was the grounding force that kept him from completely losing himself later on when the fame and the psychedelic lifestyle really threatened to swallow him whole.
And that relationship with Faye is just a massive through line. No matter how far out he pushed the boundaries of his life, he always maintained this tether to his roots, to a very traditional sense of family, loyalty, and partnership.
But then, during his time at the University of Oregon, something fundamental shifts.
Right. The academic pivot.
Exactly. He starts pivoting away from his original major in speech and communication, away from just reading pulp science fiction, because he meets a professor named James B. Hall.
And Hall introduces him to literary modernism.
Yes. And just to ground that term for a second for you listening, literary modernism was a movement that was all about breaking the traditional rules of storytelling, focusing on internal consciousness, and really questioning established societal narratives.
It was a whole new world for him.
So my read on this is that Kesey, having lost wrestling as his primary physical outlet due to that shoulder injury, realizes he can take all that fierce competitive energy and apply it to wrestling with abstract ideas instead. Does that make sense?
That is exactly the mechanism at play. I mean, he was a person with a massive reservoir of internal drive.
Yeah.
When the physical avenue was blocked, Professor Hall basically opened a door to an intellectual arena. Kesey realized that literature didn't just have to be escapism, like those Zane Grey novels.
Right, could be more.
It could be a contact sport. It could be a way to actually challenge the world.
And that desire to challenge the world leads him straight to Stanford University, which is where the friction really ignites.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of a maverick literary critic named Leslie Fiedler, who essentially advocated for this rough-hewn Oregon kid over applicants from elite Ivy League schools, Kesey wins a prestigious Woodrow Wilson Fellowship.
There's a huge deal.
Right. So he lands right in the middle of Stanford's Creative Writing Center.
Where he immediately collides with the old guard of academia.
Of course he does.
The program's director was Wallace Stegner, who was this giant of traditional Western literature, and Stegner valued structure, refinement, and classical technique.
So basically the opposite of what Kesey was becoming.
Completely. He basically viewed Kesey as an unrefined, almost dangerous threat to proper intellectualism. Stegner actually repeatedly rejected Kesey's applications for further fellowships in the department.
Think about a time you were told you didn't fit the quote-unquote proper mold for a job or a school. Kesey took that rejection and completely bypassed the gatekeepers.
He really did.
Even with Stegner pushing back, Kesey wins a $2,000 prize for an unpublished manuscript called Zoo, and he cleverly manages to just audit classes under another literary heavyweight, Malcolm Cowley.
Which is brilliant.
But while this academic rebellion is interesting, the real turning point, the thing that changes American culture, happens entirely off campus.
This is where it gets crazy.
Yeah. Through a neighbor named Vic Lovell, Kesey volunteers for a paid study at the nearby Menlo Park Veterans Hospital. And this wasn't some benign medical trial. It was Project MKUltra.
Which, requires a bit of historical context. We are in the thick of the Cold War.
Right.
The military and intelligence communities, specifically the CIA, were deeply paranoid about Soviet mind control and brainwashing.
Naturally.
So they covertly financed this highly classified program to test psychoactive drugs like LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin on American citizens.
Without really knowing what they would do.
Exactly. They wanted to see if these substances could be used as truth serums or for interrogations or, to fundamentally break and reprogram the human mind.
Yeah.
And they needed volunteers to just sit in rooms and take these unknown chemicals.
Wait, I have to pause on the sheer absurdity of this.
Yeah.
The United States government, in an attempt to weaponize mind control for the Cold War, accidentally funded the counterculture by dosing one of its future leaders.
It's wild to think about.
That is like a military experiment trying to invent a new radar system and accidentally inventing rock and roll.
The irony is just staggering. I mean, the CIA provided the exact chemical catalyst that Kesey would later use to challenge the entire fabric of the American establishment. They thought they were testing a weapon of control, but they basically handed Kesey the key to unlock the exact psychological doors they were trying to bolt shut.
So he's taking these hallucinogens as a government guinea pig, but he also needs money, right? So he takes a job working the night shift as an aide at that same psychiatric hospital.
Right.
And this environment provides the perfect storm. You have Kesey, this physically dominant former athlete, walking the halls at night, observing these heavily medicated, institutionalized patients, often while he is still feeling the lingering effects of the psychedelics from the MKUltra experiments.
And it's in those quiet, altered late-night hours that Kesey has a radical epiphany about the nature of sanity.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, he would sit and talk with these patients, listening to their stories, observing how they were treated by the medical staff.
And he concludes that these men aren't actually medically insane. He views the psychiatric ward essentially as a cultural quarantine zone.
Yes.
It's where society locked away anyone who wouldn't read from the accepted 1950s script.
Precisely. He realized these were individuals who had simply been rejected by a rigidly conformist society.
Because they didn't fit in.
Exactly. If you didn't fit the post-war, suburban, hyper-normal mold, you were labeled broken and hidden away. The institution wasn't curing them. It was punishing them for their nonconformity.
And that profound realization becomes the absolute bedrock of his masterpiece, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962.
Which was just huge.
It is a massive critical and commercial hit. I mean, it resonates with a culture that is just beginning to feel suffocated by 1950s conformity. It eventually turns into a stage play. And then, famously, the iconic 1975 film directed by Milo Forman, which swept the Oscars.
But, Kesey's relationship with that wildly successful film is incredibly telling of his character.
So what does this all mean? I mean, he despised it.
He really did.
He claimed he never even watched it. Now, his wife, Faye, reportedly supported the film and was glad it was made, which is an interesting dynamic. But Kesey himself fought with the producers over a $20,000 payment, and he vehemently disagreed with casting Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, he had a totally different vision.
He actually wanted Gene Hackman for the lead role of McMurphy. But his biggest grievance was about the narrative structure.
Right, the narrator.
In his book, the story is narrated through the internal consciousness of a Native American patient named Chief Bromden. The film abandons that and makes it a standard, objective camera view centered on Nicholson's character.
Which changes everything.
Exactly. To Kesey, that wasn't just a cinematic shortcut. It was a betrayal of the art. Changing the narrator stripped away the internal psychological depth and turned it into a conventional Hollywood rebellion story.
And that refusal to compromise his vision, even when immense fame and fortune were on the line, is really the defining trait of his next phase in life.
Right.
Because after the success of Cuckoo's Nest and the publication of his second massive novel, Sometimes a Great Notion in 1964, Kesey arrives at this crossroads.
He's made it, essentially.
Yeah, but he decides that merely writing about boundary pushing on a typewriter is no longer sufficient.
He decides he has to physically live it. The words aren't enough anymore. So he moves out to a log house in La Honda, California, deep in the redwoods.
A total change of scenery.
And in 1964, he gathers a group of eccentric, creative friends who call themselves the Merry Pranksters. They buy a 1939 International Harvester school bus, painted in these wild, swirling, neon psychedelic colors, wire it for sound, name it Further, spelled with a U, and set off on a cross-country trip to New York.
The logistics of this are just wild to consider.
Oh, I bet.
The stated goal was to consume LSD, which, we should note, was still entirely legal at the time, and essentially turn everyday American life into a spontaneous work of art.
Just a rolling art project.
Yeah, they were rolling into quiet Midwestern towns in this screamingly loud painted bus, filming the entire journey on 16-millimeter film, which was later released as the documentary Magic Trip, by the way.
Oh, right.
They were intentionally trying to cause a disruption in the matrix of normal society.
And when they get to New York, Kesey officially bridges the generational gap. He connects with the absolute royalty of the 1950s Beat Generation people like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Neil Cassady.
Which is such an amazing crossover.
Cassady, who is the real-life inspiration for Dean Moriarty and Kerouac's On the Road, actually drives the Further bus for a while. Kesey is literally linking up the old counterculture with the new one.
And then when they return to the Bay Area, Kesey scales up this vision. He starts hosting what they called acid tests.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, these were massive public parties designed to simulate the psychedelic experience for the masses.
If you've never heard of an acid test, you have to picture total sensory overload. We are talking strobe lights flashing out of rhythm, glowing fluorescent paint everywhere, unpredictable black lights, bizarre audio tape loops playing over loudspeakers, and of course, massive amounts of LSD.
Yeah, it was chaos.
He even mentors a local group of musicians who become the house band for these parties, a little band you might know as the Grateful Dead.
Just a small, unknown group, right?
Right, and this whole chaotic era is later immortalized by the journalist Tom Wolfe in his famous book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test.
It really cemented the legend.
But looking at this objectively, I have to push back on the romanticism here for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's easy to look back and view the Merry Pranksters as these whimsical pioneers, but wasn't this essentially just a group of people enabling unregulated mass drug use? Where is the actual philosophy in all that chaos?
I mean, it's a very valid critique and one that many people had at the time. But from Kesey's perspective, there was a deeply held philosophy driving it.
Which was what?
He genuinely believed that American society had become dangerously rigid and isolated. He felt that genuine human communication had completely broken down under the weight of Cold War anxiety and consumerism.
Okay, I can see that.
So his philosophy was that by injecting utter absurdity, blinding color, and altered states of consciousness into the mundane world, you could shock people out of their automated routines.
Just wake them up.
Exactly. You could show them that it was possible to be entirely, wildly different without being a threat. The method was undeniably chaotic, sure, but the ultimate goal was genuine human connection and forcing an expansion of empathy.
But faking a reality can only last so long. You can't shatter boundaries and bend the rules of society forever without the authorities finally showing up to collect the bill.
That's the truth.
And Kesey's lifestyle inevitably results in a massive collision with law enforcement. In 1965, he gets arrested for marijuana possession at his home in La Honda.
Facing serious jail time, which would completely halt his movement, Kesey decides to apply his flair for theatricality to his legal troubles.
I mean, faking your own death and living as a fugitive is an exhausting performance, but that's exactly what he does.
It's unbelievable.
He orchestrates a completely fake suicide. He has his friends leave his truck teetering on the edge of a cliffside road up near Eureka, California. He even leaves behind an elaborate, poetic suicide note to sell the illusion to the police and the media.
Like a movie.
Right. Meanwhile, he is literally being smuggled down into Mexico, hidden in the trunk of a friend's car.
And he spends 8 months living as a fugitive in Mexico. But the reality of the law eventually catches up with the myth he was writing.
It always does.
He sneaks back into the United States, is eventually caught by the FBI, and is sentenced to 6 months in a Redwood City jail.
And as proof that he simply could not turn off his rebellious instincts, he is arrested again just 2 nights after his initial release.
2 nights.
2 nights. For smoking marijuana on the roof of Stuart Brand's home in San Francisco alongside a fellow prankster named Carolyn Adams.
He just couldn't help himself.
And just to highlight how unconventional his domestic life was, he later fathered a daughter named Sunshine with Carolyn Adams, and his wife Faye was completely supportive and accepting of this arrangement.
It was a very different way of living.
But looking at the fake suicide, the Mexican exile, the arrests, by this point, did Kesey view his own life as just another novel he was writing in real time?
I think the line between Ken Kesey, the author, and Ken Kesey, the character, had completely devolved by that point.
Yeah.
Faking his death wasn't just a practical legal maneuver. It was an extension of his art. He was using the police, the media, and the American public as his audience.
That sounds exhausting, though.
Oh, maintaining that level of sustained high-stakes performance is incredibly draining. The exhaustion of being a living myth ultimately forces a complete reset in how he chooses to live.
Which transitions us to a much quieter and ultimately heartbreaking phase of his life. After serving his time, Kesey steps completely away from the cultural frontline.
He goes back home.
He moves back to a family farm in Pleasant Hill, Oregon. He transitions into writing essays, he self-publishes a literary magazine called Spit in the Ocean, and he starts teaching at the University of Oregon.
A totally different pace.
Right. He even writes a novel collaboratively with his graduate students under the pseudonym O.U. Levan. It seems like he has finally found a quiet peace.
Until 1984, when that peace is shattered by an unimaginable personal tragedy.
Yeah. His 20-year-old son, Jed, who was a champion wrestler at the University of Oregon just like his dad, is killed in a horrific highway crash.
It's just devastating.
The wrestling team was traveling to a match in Washington State. Because the athletic department lacked the funding to provide a proper, safe bus, the team was packed into a loaned passenger van.
Oh, man.
The van hit an icy patch of highway, lost control, and rolled. Jed suffered severe head trauma and was declared brain dead 2 days later.
The loss of a child is universally devastating, but it sparked a very specific political awakening in Kesey.
It really did.
He didn't just retreat into his grief. He directed his anger at the systemic priorities that led to the crash.
He writes an incredibly powerful open letter to Senator Mark Hatfield. And to be clear to you listening, we aren't taking a political stance on this. We're just conveying Kesey's mindset and arguments at the time.
Right, this was his perspective.
Kesey essentially argues that the tax dollars the government is pouring into massive, abstract military defense budgets are entirely misplaced if they can't even protect citizens at home.
Which is a heavy point to make.
He points out the devastating irony that the nation can afford multi-million-dollar artillery shells, but can't afford to provide a safe bus with basic seatbelts for college athletes traveling through the snow.
He took the massive, untouchable concept of national defense and contrasted it with the very real, localized tragedy of highway fatalities and underfunded athletic programs.
Exactly.
It was a profound critique of what society actually values versus what it claims to value.
And he puts his money where his mouth is. Kesey personally donates over $33,000 to purchase a proper, heavy-duty, safe bus for the University of Oregon wrestling team.
Right.
And I really want you listening to think about the heartbreaking poetry of the 2 defining vehicles in Kesey's life.
Oh, the 2 buses.
Yes. The first is Further, this chaotic, wildly painted school bus meant to intentionally drive society off the edge of convention and into danger and discovery. It was all about rejecting safety.
Right.
And the second is this highly practical, purely functional athletic bus bought out of sheer grief, designed specifically to keep young men safe on icy roads. It is a stunning contrast. How does a tragedy like this reframe his understanding of vulnerability?
I mean, it forces a brutal transition from youthful invincibility to the realization of physical frailty.
Yeah.
The Further Bus was born of a time when Kesey felt untouchable. The idea that you can challenge every boundary, take every drug, taunt the police, and walk away unscathed.
And then reality hits.
Jed's death was a stark reminder of human vulnerability. It reframed his worldview from wanting to disrupt society to wanting to protect the vulnerable within it. He realized that a society doesn't just fail when it demands conformity. It also fails when it refuses to protect its own citizens who are simply trying to live their lives.
Kesey spends his final years dealing with severe health struggles, including diabetes and a stroke.
His health really declined.
He mounts one last brief tour with a play called Twister in the mid-90s, but his time in the spotlight is mostly over. His final published piece is a poignant essay calling for peace in the immediate aftermath of September 11th. He passes away shortly after that in November 2001, following complications from liver surgery.
When you synthesize his entire journey, it is breathtaking in its scope.
It really is.
I mean, he goes from being an athletic, highly disciplined small-town kid to a literal government test subject, to a literary giant redefining sanity, to a fugitive fleeing the FBI, and finally to a grieving father advocating for practical, localized safety.
A complete arc.
He famously noted that he considered himself too young to be a beatnik and too old to be a hippie. And because of that exact awkward placement in time, he was perfectly positioned to be the conduit that connected those two massive cultural shifts.
It's an incredible legacy, but it leaves you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. Kesey poured so much of his phenomenal creative genius into the physical way he lived his daily life. Painting the bus, hosting the acid tests, orchestrating a fake suicide.
He made his life his art.
Did his insistence on living out his art in real time ultimately overshadow the incredible literature he actually wrote? If he had stayed at his desk instead of getting on that bus, what other masterpieces might he have produced?
That is the eternal debate surrounding Kesey. He chose to make his life his greatest narrative.
It really is fascinating. Understanding historical figures like Kesey, especially the ones who blur the line so heavily between creator and creation, gives us a much sharper lens on our own culture today. Because when you look closely, you realize the expectation of a clean, orderly life is rarely the reality of genius. Sometimes the clean-cut champion wrestler practicing ventriloquism is the exact same guy who ends up painting a school bus neon and permanently altering the American consciousness.
The human mind is rarely binary, and Kesey proved that better than anyone.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning the boundaries, and we'll catch you next time.